Hello, 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 everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to Getting the Answers episode 25. Today is going to be a fun episode as always, but before we get into all of the details of the episode, I'll give my chance for my co host to give a little bit of an introduction.
Yes, hello, I'm Anavultus, your co-host on this show. Last episode was on my channel, and as will be the next episode. So look forward to that. And we alternate. So today's question is, of course, in relation to third parties.
Yes. So, I just wanted to start with just a general question, and then we can spend time in what we have for websites and the data you analyze, because I think that's the more interesting part of what this episode is going to be. But do you have any interest in third parties? Do you think that the United States should have third parties? Those are kind of two separate questions, but I just thought we could start there and then go into the details.
Well, on the question of third parties themselves, as to whether we should have third parties, I say that in theory, I sort of agree with some of the founding fathers on the idea that there really shouldn't be parties at the top level of government, and that politicians should be motivated based on uh, their own skills and convictions and the necessary things to do the job. So in that sense, I don't really like the idea of parties in that sense. Now, when we're looking at the current system, I see real reasons why third parties have disadvantages based on how the system is organized. I would, however, like to see better alternatives to various things. So in that sense, I do like third parties. And whenever there's an election, I will and I receive a ballot, I will analyze each candidate on the ballot, including ones from parties that I normally wouldn't vote for, and then I choose the candidate that I think is the best to vote for, even if I don't think that candidate has a chance to win. So even though I am affiliated with a party, one of the main parties, I also occasionally vote for independent and third party candidates.
Right, right. There's a I'll just start with kind of go backwards in answering this question. What you said at last is kind of an interesting thing that I also think third parties have to face with general elections, especially, and probably local elections a little bit as well. But mostly general elections are swing states, are states that could go different directions. You always have like, well, if I vote for this candidate, it could take away from candidate B winning, and candidate A is so much worse. And so it's like I almost feel like I have to vote for this, major party. And then when the person votes for the person that they want the most, being the third party candidate, and candidate A wins in the state and not the better candidate B, so to speak, then they feel guilty. So it's kind of a funny issue that's not really that funny, but it's something I've noticed a lot in elections. That's potentially another problem third parties face in the way the system's set up. But to answer the question for myself, I've always had interest in third parties since I've become, politically involved in looking at politics, and I've looked at all of the major third parties really, and right now I think I'm mostly aligned with the libertarians, so to speak. But I've only had to vote in one general election so far, and I wasn't too much in favor of the libertarian candidate that was running for that year. So, it's kind of a funny thing when it comes to that as well. But I do think that third parties are needed, and ultimately, in one of the charts I'm going to show here in a little bit, it seems like the majority of the general public also likes third parties, but it doesn't correlate to votes. So that's kind of a weird concept, as we're going to see later in this chart. But I just thought that in general, Americans like to choose. So you would think that third parties would be more popular than they are in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch this over here. There we go. Alrighty, so this is just Ballotpedia. They're just a website that has data, and you can look up politicians and their voting records and whatnot, and ballot sheets on this website. So at the top here, they just show how many states each of the major third parties have, with the Libertarian Party being 35, the Green Party being 22, and the Constitutional Party, or Constitution Party, being 15. But I'm going to scroll back down all the way to the bottom here.
Is that ballot access or
ballot access, yes.
what is that? Okay.
Essentially, I'll scroll back up just so we can let everybody read through just in case. But basically, what it says there is that these are states that were on the ballot in the last general election, meaning that you could pick the candidate directly and not have to write in the candidate or have to, not have to write in the candidate. So I think the Libertarians had like 45 or maybe even higher than that states available to vote for their candidate, but they would have to be a write-in and not somebody that's purely just on the ballot. And each state works different for ballots as well. It's not a universal thing you have to meet. You have to meet each state's requirements, and some states are stricter than others to get ballot access on their state. So that's another thing to throw out for people that may not be aware of that. But I think in Gary Johnson years that the Libertarians had ballot access on all states. I could be mistaken on that, but I think one of those years they did. But ballot access is another major issue with third parties getting the chance to even be to even have a chance, to put it that way. So this is the chart I was talking about a little bit ago.
Yep.
So it starts in 2003, and then it goes to 2016, and it shows the existing parties do an adequate job, third parties needed, and then no opinion. So when you start in 2003 with the first category, existing parties do an adequate job, it's 56%. Thinking that more of the parties is doing a good job, with 40% thinking that a third party is needed. Now, just to show a comparison for the most recent data, in 2016, it shows 37% or one of the two parties is doing an adequate job, 57% think a third party is needed, and 6% have no opinion. And this was collected through Gallup, which is a very popular data collection and polling company, website, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
I don't think they're doing as much political polls anymore, but that's what they were kind of known for a while. But I just thought that data was interesting. For one thing, you would think that if 37% of Americans think that the party's doing a good job, that leaves 63, if my math is correct, percent of people that don't think the party is doing a good job. So you would think that a third party would become more popular because it's almost 2/3 of Americans. But you don't really see that necessarily in votes. So I think that's just an interesting concept.
Yeah.
Oop, let me scroll up.
Yeah, and I think another thing that it has to do with is that there's people that, while they disagree with how their party might be going, one of the main parties, they may think that the party that exists could do a better job. So there's people that, instead of going for a third party, are perhaps more interested in reforming their party or seeing a different faction within the party become greater. So that's another split there, I would say, that would explain the discrepancy.
Right, definitely so. I think that's a major problem, especially on election years. Now, of course, this is kind of relating to elections. That's what parties are for, since it is a political party, not just, a company or anything. But I think that that's a very large part. It's almost like that guilt I was talking about earlier, that a lot of people in swing states will tend to just vote for lesser of two evils instead of someone they may truly like more, because they're afraid that it could it could make their candidate lose. I'm gonna go turn that alarm off before it makes the stream go crazy. Sorry about that.
Yep. Yep. Yes, third parties, of course, are not always effective in elections, and one of the reasons, of course, is that people tend to vote strategically, and I would say that it makes sense in light of the pressure that is put on the people by both politicians as well as the actual parties themselves. I think it's important to put a distinction between parties and politicians to understand that the actual committees that run the parties aren't the same as the politicians.
Yes, that's a very good point, I think. And I think a lot of people
Yeah,
generally.
because
Oh, no, go on.
let me tell you,
Go ahead.
yeah, because not too long ago I went to a meeting of the Republican Party committee in the county where I am, just to check things out, see how things are, and very obviously, and it makes sense that it goes this way, the party is strongly opposed to third parties existing. Um, and that is because the purpose of a party is to drive voters to the candidates of the party. So even if it leaves people with fewer choices, that is their main drive. And it makes sense internally looking at it, why they would do that. And it also explains why there is opposition to things like ranked choice voting, because it would be a disadvantage to the actual party organizations, to the politicians who rely on the party organizations, and most of all to lobbyists and businesses trying to lobby candidates and to perhaps gain favorable policies through campaign donations, because it puts more viable candidates in the race to win, which makes their spending on campaign donations less efficient in relation to what they're trying to achieve.
Right. Right. I mean, in a way that makes sense from a major party's perspective. And I did watch your video on ranked choice voting, where you brought up many of those concepts too. And frankly, I mean, it does make sense. All of the things you just mentioned here and the topics you mentioned on the video. And that's even if you just take out business interest and business dollars that go into campaigns and just think about how much money a campaign has to spend. The more valuable a third party is in the state, the more money they're going to have to spend. I mean, that just makes sense. You can kind of see that in what's happening in California right now with the recall vote, because there's a very popular libertarian candidate, Jeff Hewitt, who is running for the recall to be governor. And right now, he, with polls you see here and there, he's about third place. And numerous people that are having their name on the ballot, so to speak, or the name on their people to vote for. So it's possible that the governors there who are actually really wanting to become governors are going to have to spend a lot more money from one of the more major parties there. So that just makes sense to me. We're going to move to my next article, and I just wanted to show the top part here, and then there's a chart I was going to show a little bit later in this article, and this is by Gallup as well. Well, the first one was Ballotpedia, but anyway. 62% say a third party is needed, up from 57% in September. Highest support for a third party by 1 percentage point. A record high 63% of Republicans favor a third party. And so this was in relation to Trump. Just to put things in perspective, there was a theory that Trump was going to make a third party because the Republicans might not let him run, blah 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 blah, and there was a big fury going on,
Yeah.
and it was going to be the Patriot Party, and many Republicans, Gallup decided to poll, and well, you saw it there. Was it 66%, right? 63% were more than likely to favor that.
Yeah, there's also another possibility that was around for some time when Liz Cheney was ousted from party leadership, that some people were thinking that the anti-Trump Republicans, especially the more center-left ones, were going to split off from the party and form a third party. So that was another theory. Now, neither of those things have happened. So we're not looking at that. However, for some time there was serious talks about such things happening.
Right. And you see the chart here for Gallup for anyone that's interested in charts. I like charts myself. But I think that's we're kind of going along the same lines that I showed in the first chart, with generally people are favoring a third party. The next one, Gallup decided to poll Democrats, and Democrats had the same results, not as highly as Republicans, but still pretty high results from what they were in the past. With 47% have a favorable view of the Democratic Party, 42% are favorable of the GOP. Republican Party image has sliced in January. Majority in the U.S. say a third party is needed. And then we scroll down here, you see the trends between the major parties, with Republicans kind of going up and down a little bit more sporadically, or whatever. I don't think I said that word right. But anyway. And then Democrats tending to be a lot more flatlined, but still having some ups and downs. When you scroll back down to here, it was a little further down. Nope. I think it's at the bottom. Yeah, here we go. So this was kind of the trend that they were collecting here. And the reason it's... So Democrats are kind of interesting. And if you go on to read the article, it mentions this. But I don't think we necessarily need to see it unless you want to. But it necessarily states that a lot of times Democrats are either in support of their party fully, or in a large part in support of their party when compared to Republicans in a lot of ways. But also there's a big percentage of Democrats that are wanting a third party to be made out of the progressive candidates, such as AOC and the squad members and maybe even Bernie, of them to create a progressive party because they're wanting to have change now. Not change in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but change now. So that's what the article was kind of mentioning, that there's a big fraction even in the Democratic Party of Democrats even seeking a third party.
Yeah, and of course Bernie himself wasn't always a Democrat. He has been in I think he was an independent when he was in office back then. However, he generally caucused with the Democrats in Congress.
Right, and he's run for president as Democrat both times, obviously, and we know how that turned out, with many people on the progressive side saying that the DNC is corrupt, but we don't necessarily have to talk about that. But that's that's a whole separate topic there. But yeah, Bernie is a technically third party, if I'm not mistaken, right? He has his own thing.
Um, I don't know if as far as I'm aware, I don't know if he's part. It, he well, for the purpose of the elections, he was in the Democratic Party, but I don't know if he's actually, when he was in office, was part of a third party. I'd have to check on that. I don't think he was. I think he was an independent, or at least he had his own campaign, which is somewhat different than a third party if you're only running as one candidate. I think there was a senator who ran under the name of a particular party that he had made, but it was actually an independent run. So there's a bit of a difference between having a one person party and an actual organized party.
Right, right. And I am not sure if he's technically a part of a third party or not, or just independent, as you just stated. But I do know that he had to switch to Democrat to run for the general election and run for president. And I don't even think he switched to Democrat when he ran for Senate, but I could be mistaken on that as well. I'm not for sure on those
Okay,
details.
I looked it up.
Mm-hmm.
I looked it up, and he was an independent in Congress. Well, he still is in Congress, sorry, but he's an independent in Congress that caucuses with the Democrats.
Right, right. Which, in a large part, makes sense from listening to more progressive or progressive content creators and whatnot. They tend to favor Bernie Sanders in a large way, probably because of his independent nature, to put it that way. And
Yeah.
many people are upset with Democrats and them not pushing for as progressive as policy as they wished, especially since at the time of when all this was going down and these polls were getting placed and whatnot, Bernie was leading, and then he fell off the totem pole for whatever reason you want to state. But the reason I just bring that up is I think that you're starting to see it really on both sides. And I don't know if you necessarily could have said that in other elections. Now, there were elections like Ross Perot and other major candidates that ran as a third party and got decently popular, but they happen kind of sporadically. I think now we're starting to see more of a trend in that both parties are becoming upset at what's happening. Now, are the votes going to come from it? I don't necessarily know. I think we have to wait a lot longer to see actually votes coming to third parties just because of the way America views their political system. I think America just sees it as two parties. There may even be 3, 4, 5 parties on your ballot, but people don't really see it. They just see who they should vote for as the candidates they see on the debate stage. And the only way you're going to see the other candidates is if you seek it out. And in the politics, there's very few percentage of people, voting population, that actually are going to seek it out.
Yeah. And I think another problem is, and we can talk about this later when we look at the data that I've aggregated. Um, a lot of candidates for third parties, or not just the candidates, but the third parties themselves, focus on getting a big presidential race when it's not really practical.
Right, that's definitely a strategy, and we can get to that point. I can bring up the data now if we want to jump to that. Let me scroll this back up. I think these were the same. Yeah, let me push this back. Switch the tab over. Oh, let me get this out. 1 second, everybody. I had to put 2 captures because I couldn't get it to work for the one. So we're just going to move this out.
I sent you 2 pictures and 2 PDFs.
Okay.
Yeah, for those of you who are wondering what we're looking at right now, I looked through the history of presidential elections and congressional seats, uh, and essentially seven offices that you can get elected for, which is president, vice president, elector for the presidency, president pro temp in the Senate, speaker of a house in the House, U.S. senator, U.S. representative, governor, and state legislature. And I took all the parties, at least the ones that I counted, that made a national office. And I also looked at whether they had received governorship and state legislative positions. And I aggregated all the data. I also looked at what percentage of electors they got in their peak year, as well as how much of the Senate and the House they controlled at their strongest. I didn't want to look at them in total, looking at how many people they got elected total, because not all parties existed at all times. So I didn't think that that would be a useful comparison.
Right. I have the first sheet up on screen if you're looking at it on your computer as well. The one you first sent me that doesn't have the percentage points yet. I also have the one with the percentage points and the last one you sent me with the graph and all of the parties and kind of a more of a concise list. So I don't know where you wanted to start on the data there.
Are you looking at the one with the ones and zeros?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So this one is looking at a one meaning means that the party achieved the office. A zero means that the party didn't achieve the office. So I would say that the main parties achieved between a seven, eight, or nine. Um, More successful third parties got four, five, and six, and the less successful third parties got one, two, and one, twos, and threes on the total column.
Right. I'm just going down for people in the back there. Okay. So to while we're looking at this, to ask just a question that we were kind of talking about, and you can tell me if we should wait on this question or not. But when you're mentioning that a lot of third parties decide to run for presidential elections despite it being a lost cause, to say, maybe lost cause is the wrong word, but resources could be spent better. Do you think that that's to gain media attention? Do you think they actually see it as having a chance? Like, what do you think the reason for that is in a way?
Well, obviously, it does provide a lot of publicity to the party. However, it also, I would say, antagonizes certain people who see it as having a spoiler effect, which is something that is undesirable. So it really depends on how you want to calculate the effectiveness of them running. Because, as I mentioned before, big corporations don't like third parties in big races. Uh, so what they would need to do is try to win smaller races and then build up from there. And we can see some parties that did this. For example, the Nullifier Party, which was very strong in South Carolina, was a party that operated almost exclusively in South Carolina, and of course the federal delegates from South Carolina. So that was a party that went for local strategy and became reasonably strong. There's others, such as the Wisconsin Progressive Party, if we're looking further down, and as well as the Farmer Labor Party from Minnesota, which eventually merged with the Democrats in Minnesota to form the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is today a subunit of the Democratic Party in Minnesota, although people can argue whether it's a party of its own or whether it's a subpart of the Democrats. For the purpose of this chart, I consider them Democratic, and I put the Farmer Labor Party separate from that.
Okay.
But anyway, those were some parties that had a very strong position within a state and therefore were very relevant in that sense.
Right. So that's another topic to bring up, or just something to mention. Especially in my mind, a lot of times I thought that third parties were only really national parties, but that isn't necessarily the case. And when I say national, I mean across multiple states. But there's a lot of cases where there are localized state sort of parties.
Yeah, I think the most recent powerful state party that went national would be the Conservative Party of New York State, which is on the chart. It operated in the 70s, was when it was the strongest, 1970s. And I think it was eventually absorbed by the Republicans. And that's a trend you see with some of the third parties. They come up, they expand, and then they get absorbed by another party, or they might be led by a particular politician who then, after that politician is gone, the voters simply go to one of the main parties or to another party. For example, if we're looking at the chart again, we have the Anti-Monopoly Party and the Greenback Labor Party and a number of other parties in that period of U.S. history. By the way, the way the parties are organized is generally on when they emerged. So later parties are newer parties. Now, it's not an exact science because you can argue when they got into office and when the party was actually established. But what we see in the late 1800s with a anti-monopoly party, Greenback Labor Party, Union Labor Party, People's Party is a sort of political realignment in relation to civil service and policies that people didn't like about the government. So we also see the Silver Party, the Republican Silver Party in that time period. All these parties were parties based on particular issues and became somewhat successful because of the fact that the government wasn't addressing these issues. And some people have argued that the People's Party actually had a huge influence on restructuring the Democratic Party, because what happens with a lot of these parties that focus on issues is, in order to remain competitive against the emerging third party, the main party will actually change its policies to cater to voters of that third party. And that's what we see in a number of these cases.
Right, if they become big enough, right? Yeah. And that, I mean, so to talk about parties that run on particular issues or have an issue as like their number one stance. So this is just a general question, not. So when you have like the Silver Party or something, just I don't know exactly if they did this or not, but let's just assume that they were backing silver as it is in their name, right? As a alternative currency or as a way to back the U.S. dollar instead of gold, maybe. If that was a debate back in whatever time period.
Well, I think it was in addition to gold.
Or in addition to gold? Okay, well, in addition to gold, to back the U.S. dollar. And that's the only thing they're necessarily running on. It would make sense to have, if they become popular enough, for that state, or if they're even more popular, for their party as a whole, to adapt the policy that the third party has to get their voters. And that would probably work. Do you think that nowadays that's why a lot of third parties that exist now are more broad? Like they have a philosophy, like the libertarian philosophy, get off my lawn, liberty, those type of stances. Do you think that that's why small government, they use things like that instead of just running on one idea anymore?
Yeah, well, I would say that I would say four types of parties in relation to ideas. You have big tent parties that don't really have any idea beyond a general vibe. So that's today's Republicans and Democrats, um, whose members, however, can become more ideological. Then you have ideological parties, parties with a particular ideology that is a bit less flexible. So you see that in the libertarians, the American Party to some extent, and there's a number of other parties like the Socialist Labor Party would be a party that's ideological because they're socialist. And then you have single issue parties such as the Free Soil Party, Silver Party, um, and various other parties. And then you have single purpose parties, parties that rather than even having a policy issue, they exist for a very specific purpose, such as the Constitutional Union Party, which attempted to disrupt the 1860 election to force a an election without a clear winner, where they instead then wanted Congress to decide on a winner, and then they were planning on promoting the restructuring of the Constitution in order to fix the North-South issue in various ways. But or the 1924 Progressive Party, led by La Follette Sr., and that existed largely to get him into the presidency, although it did also have other purposes as well.
Right, right. I mean, it makes sense to have these different types of parties in a large part because America is the melting pot, so to speak. It has a lot of different ideas. And in a large way, it makes sense that if you're a third party, you're going to want something to identify yourself with. So the idea of having one core issue and that's what your whole third party is about, or having a philosophy like some parties take that approach of, makes a lot of sense because you're able to grab people in that way, especially if you're running for the state and it's a state issue or are always a major issue. I think I get that. It definitely makes sense. And something that I don't know if a lot of people know necessarily, because third parties tend to, like, I didn't know most of these third parties had existed. Now, a lot of them are in history and not existing now, so to speak, but I didn't even know that they existed in the first place. I do know that I saw data with the Prohibition Party that one of their candidates for governor, I think it was in the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken, won maybe, yeah, I think it was 1800s, if the party was alive then. But long story short, I know that one of their candidates that run for governor ended up winning the governor as prohibition as part of the Prohibition Party, and it was a lady, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong on that. But I think I've seen success for.
I don't think it was a lady, if I remember correctly. But yeah, the Prohibition Party, active late 1800s, early 1900s, uh, was in favor of the prohibition of alcohol, and their policy was not led by their party in the end, and was instead adopted by uh, the other politicians in, I think it was the Democratic Party at the time in power.
Right, so another tragic case of a third party losing its favorability because one of the major parties takes it over, so to speak. I think these are the
Yeah.
same. No,
But
they're
that's
not.
also, is that a loss though, or is it a success? Because if the if your political position on a single issue party becomes mainstream
Yeah, they're the same.
in one of the parties, I think some people would actually consider that to be a success, unless you're actually a politician who's trying to gain power from that third party, in which case uh, you have to then transfer to the main party or remain separate and become a, a less viable candidate. Now, of course, the Prohibition Party still exists today and it still runs candidates today. However, they're not, I don't think they have ballot access really.
Well, that is the thing. Is it's very hard to get ballot access for a lot of states, and some states are super strict. Even well, it's hard to get ballot access, which also hurts third parties. But to answer your question, I do understand with what you're saying. If your goal, your third party, is to get this policy to be the policy, or for a major party to adapt it, but those both would ultimately lead to the same result. Maybe. Not all the time do political parties keep their promises, but you would think that them having it as one of their promises could be a success if that's what your goal was, especially if you're having like the silver party, or like we mentioned before. I'm just throwing it as an example. And if you end up getting silver also backed with gold on the US dollar, then ultimately what you seek to have happen worked. So I can see that perspective. I just think a lot of third parties, even though it may be foolish for them to think so, are really trying to seek success at a state level and ultimately at a national level. But that may not be what all parties are seeking to have happen.
Yeah. And of course, there's sometimes when the main party is actually uh, absorbed into a third party and this was a very weird instance. I don't think we can talk about it on this chart. You can actually pull up the picture associated with this chart. I think it helps us look at the data as well.
Let me see where I put the picture. Let me leave this chart up real quick. I'm going to, yeah, this chart. I'm trying to find where I put the picture. 1 second. Do not see where I put this. I'm going to bounce over to the Discord again. One second, everybody. I'll just flip the screen so we don't see black. 1 second. While I get these pictures loaded, I'll just ask a general question here. So, do you see political parties having a agenda to run, say, through the legislator? Because I've seen a lot of candidates talk about, third parties talk about legislators. Do you think that that's a approach to have as a third party?
To run through legislators?
Yes. In other words, like, I know a legislator is different than, say, running for Congress or running for a governor or one of the other topics you could run under. But my main question here is,
As in a state legislator?
yes, a state legislator. My main question here is: do you think that that's a valuable approach to do to gain your philosophy or gain your policies through passing laws and rules, whatever you want to call it, through the state level.
I think it is a very solid strategy, and a number of different parties followed this. Now, in some way, and the state level is just an additional point on here to talk about whether those parties actually had a state involvement. For example, there's some parties such as the American Independent Party, the States Right Democratic Party, which was in opposition, which is the Dixiecrats, which are parties that essentially only ran on the presidential level and didn't really have candidates anywhere else. Although you could argue the States Rights Democratic Party had people on lower levels of government. However, they were all officially affiliated with the Democratic Party.
Right. Which I just think that that's an interesting
And
approach.
yeah,
No, go on. Sorry. Let me.
uh, no, I think I've said it. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I just that's also something I haven't necessarily thought about, that third parties could take that approach, but that does make a whole lot of sense to do, because in a large part the whole goal of a third party is to pass policies, and you're able to do that through the legislator and locally much easier than you are if you take a senator or congressman or even in a large part a mayor or governor position. In a large part, governor does have pretty big impact, especially on some states where their power is not as restrained, to say the least. I'm about to pull up these
yeah.
images.
Especially if it's a financially independent state,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of states are not financially independent. A lot of states rely on federal funding, but some of them don't, and those states generally have more latitude in what kinds of things they can do because they don't have to rely on the government giving them money.
Right. And also some states are have a uni legislator, I think is what it's called. No, uni house. In other words, they don't have to go through as many.
Unicameral,
Yes, that's the word. Yes.
unicameral.
Yes, thank you. I knew I
Yeah,
had it on the.
that's why I put state legislature instead of state house and senate, because I know that some states only have one chamber, so uh, putting both wouldn't make sense because it wouldn't really be transferable. I think it would be an unfair comparison. One thing that's important to look at here is actually the hardest office for a party to achieve seems to be the president pro temp. Um, it's although it's been not achieved by one of the five major parties. So the six main parties, which are the Federalists, uh, who in their day were opposed by the Republicans, frequently called by historians Democratic Republicans, although they called themselves Republicans. I put them here as Jeffersonian just to make the distinction. And then there's the National Republicans and the Democrats. The National Republicans didn't get a president pro temp. Um, and the Whig Party became a main party, and then the Republicans, including the National Union during the Civil War, became a main party. Um, the only third party to get a Speaker of the House is the American Party, also called Native American Party, or the Know Nothings, which actually started out as a secret society called, I think, the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. And the reason why they're called Know Nothings is because when asked about their society, they say, "I know nothing."
which is kind of funny. Um, right now we're getting the images pulled up. I don't know why they took so long to load. I thought I already had them, but I don't know. It's doing the circle of doom right now. So let me close this tab out real quick. Meanwhile, we'll bring this back up so it gives something to... We're going to close this. Ready? Oh, shoot. Okay, here we go. Okay, 1 second, everybody. Perfect, here we go. And we're gonna move this. Alrighty. Oh.
But it's interesting that 10%, or just over 10% of the parties that made it to federal office did not have any state legislators.
Yeah, that is very bizarre. Do
Yeah,
you...
but these are generally the presidential only parties. So that's the American Independent Party, the States' Rights Democratic Party, and the Constitutional Union Party, because they are essentially parties that really only existed to compete on the presidential level.
So they were running for just presidential campaigns then, and not local, like...
Yeah, although the Constitutional Union Party didn't actually intend to win. I think that's worth noting. They intended to split the vote in order to force Congress to decide on the winner.
Okay.
Now they failed, and Abraham Lincoln got elected.
Oh. Sorry about that. Alright, we're almost there. Oh. Why does it keep doing that? Oh, I know why. Alright, let me make sure we can see this on the screen real quick. When I switch it over.
So what are we looking at now?
This is the first chart, I believe. If not, I do have the other chart. If we can move to that if you want to talk about the other one first. But let me do this. Just make sure that we can see it on screen. Okay. I need to go to the other tab. This is still this one. Okay. This chart. We should be able to switch this over. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'm
So
going.
are we looking at the one with?
This is the one with the red and blue lines. That has the
Red and blue lines?
Yes.
That the red, blue, and yellow? Or
Yes.
orange?
Yes, yellow.
That one?
The orange
Yeah,
one.
okay,
Yes.
so we're looking at the percentages?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is very interesting because it shows that Uh, the most powerful parties in U.S. history were all founded before 1860, so before the Civil War. And part of it is because the United States became more unified after the Civil War, so there was a more national outlook. But this also helps us look at the collapse of a number of different political parties. So, for example, the first party system is the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, with the Federalists formally organizing after the presidency of George Washington, but the ones that would become the Federalists being dominant during the presidency of George Washington. But eventually, uh, their although they had a comeback, I think during the presidency of James Madison, their popularity eventually dropped, and it came to the point that the Jeffersonian Republicans were dominant in both houses of Congress and also on the presidential election, receiving 100% of the electoral votes in, I believe it's the 1824 election, the one where John Quincy Adams won. Now, to be fair, it was split between four different candidates, and they had to get Congress to decide. And this led to the second party system emerging, where the former Federalists and the Republicans that supported John Quincy Adams formed the National Republican Party. In later on, stronger in opposition to Andrew Jackson, and the people that supported Andrew Jackson eventually formed the Democratic Party, which took some time to gain dominance, because the Democrats were the most powerful during the years of the Great Depression. So it actually took quite some time for them to reach their peak in power.
Right.
And if we're, yeah.
No, I was just gonna say that just to keep my history right. What was the name before they were called Democrats? Was it the Whigs or was it the other one?
Um, no, the Whigs eventually were the opponents of the Democrats.
Okay.
And the Whigs were called that because they wanted to emphasize their Republican values, because Whig was a term also used in British politics, in opposition to the Tories, who were people that wanted a strong monarchy. And the Whigs saw Jacksonian democracy as leaning into monarchy. But the Whigs actually formed from the merger of the anti-Masons and the National Republicans. The anti-Masons being led by, I think it's Henry Clay, because the National Republicans weren't strong enough, and the anti-Masons formed because they didn't like the strength of Masons in American politics. But they eventually merged to form the Whig Party. And
Right.
think if we actually look at the peak of House control, we see that between the peak of the National Republican Party and the peak of the Anti-Masonic Party, those don't actually add up to the peak of the Whig Party, and that's because the two parties were competing against each other in different periods of time. The Democrats came out of the majority section of the Jeffersonian Republican Party that followed after Andrew Jackson. The nullifiers emerged during John Quincy Adams's presidency and at the beginning of Andrew Jackson's presidency from John C. Calhoun in South Carolina. And as you can see, they actually had a very consistent showing in electoral votes, the peak Senate control and peak House control, and that is because they controlled a specific state. Uh, so they were relatively powerful in South Carolina. However, outside of that, not so much. And this was during the time of a nullification crisis, wherein in South Carolina they wanted to nullify federal laws in regards to I think it was tariffs at the time, and that eventually a similar crisis happened again at the start of the Civil War. But ultimately, what destroyed the second party system with the Whigs and the Democrats is the annexation of large amounts of territory, including Texas and the Mexican cession during the Democratic Polk administration, that caused a problem for the Whigs in the Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore administration, where Millard Fillmore eventually supported the 1850 compromise that was made on how slave states and Union states were to be decided, and he supported the Fugitive Slave Act, which was highly controversial in the North. And so the Whigs splintered into a coalition of smaller parties that together were known as the opposition party, because the Whigs couldn't really remain unified at this period in time, and the Democrats strengthened themselves in the South. The Law and Order Party of Rhode Island is another local party that emerged in response to a rebellion in Rhode Island. The American Party, or the Know Nothings, were a party that dissolved at around the time of the start of the Civil War. They were heavily anti-immigrant and were opposed to the Democrats because they believed the Democrats were being controlled by the Roman Catholics, who they saw as a threat to their democracy due to the revolutions of 1848 in Europe being suppressed by a number of countries, the majority of which were Roman Catholics, and they perceived the Pope at the time as supporting these monarchists that were suppressing the nationalist revolutions. So the American Party was anti-democrat, anti-immigration, pro-union, but were actually neutral on the issue of slavery. So once the Civil War started, they sort of dissolved. The Liberty Party, Free Soil Party, and the People's Party of Indiana, as well as the Republicans, were small anti-slavery parties that emerged during the collapse of the Whig Party. And there's also the Unionists and the Unconditional Unionists who emerged during this time period as well. And the Southern Rights Party, which was in favor of slavery. But the Unionists and the other small anti-slavery parties eventually merged largely into the Republicans, who were the most powerful during the Reconstruction era and have never been as powerful since, interestingly enough. In fact, I think there was a period of 40 years starting in the Roosevelt administration where the Republicans never controlled the House until the 90s. Interestingly enough.
I have heard of that before, that statistic. which just seems crazy to me, especially in the world we live in today, where it flips every election.
Yeah, the opposition party in the South is another pro-Southern party and should be distinguished from the Whigs being relabeled opposition party at the end of their party. The Constitutional Union Party, I mentioned this before, was a party designed to split the vote. The Conservative Party of Virginia was a conservative party that emerged during the Reconstruction era in Virginia, eventually being absorbed by other parties. The Liberal Republicans were a party that opposed the presidency of U.S. Grant, and actually, in their election, was it the 1868 election, or no, the 1872 election? Their candidate Horace Greeley, you may have heard of him, depends on how much you know about U.S. history, won about 66 electoral votes, but he died before the his electors met, which led to his party splitting. Well, not his party, but the electors splitting the vote between a number of different liberal, Republican, and Democratic candidates, leading to them to actually only receive, I think, 22 of the votes, and the rest going to Democrats. So in theory, they could be about 3 times higher on their peak electoral vote if Horace Greeley had lived, but he didn't. And it is worth noting that Horace Greeley was also nominated by the Democrats, and this is a rare case wherein a third party was supported by the second party at the time, and some of the Democrats at the convention actually didn't want to support Horace Greeley because they were afraid that the Democratic Party was going to collapse and be absorbed by the liberal Republicans, which didn't end up happening. So, in the period after the Reconstruction, the Gilded Era, you have a number of small parties emerging with various amounts of success. Anti-monopoly, the Greenbacks, Readjusters, Union Labor Party, People's Party, Silver Republican Party, Socialist Party of America. All of these parties were interested in social reforms and economic reforms because the country was having some trouble at the time with those things. And civil service reform became a major point in a lot of presidential elections, partially to appease these parties and also because it was deemed necessary. And as I said, the main parties generally adapted their policies to fit a number of the different policies supported by the smaller parties. So we ended up having anti-monopoly legislation, having silver coinage, having greenbacks as well, and having labor laws reformed and a number of different things. And that's why a lot of these parties died down. It's because the main parties were formed for that. The Progressive Party was led by Theodore Roosevelt. He did pretty well in the election. I think, I don't remember exactly, maybe it was in a popular vote or the electoral vote, but he actually did better than the incumbent Taft, who had formerly been his vice president but ran for president after he was out of office. He actually did better than Taft in one of those categories. However, the party ultimately didn't gain much traction, and its policies were absorbed by other parties. The Prohibition Party was a very vocal party, but it was very small. The Farmer Labor Party, a local party in the Progressive Party of 1924, led by the politician La Follette Sr. From Wisconsin. And that party died down, but eventually another progressive party was founded by La Follette Jr. in Wisconsin and held a reasonable amount of success for a few years. And so they did have members of the Senate and the House and had some marginal success there. The American Labor Party, another small party that didn't really make it very much, of course, was in favor of labor reforms and labor rights. A more soft socialist party. The States Rights Democratic Party, which is the Dixiecrats in the presidential election, which they lost. There was another presidential election where the southern states split the vote, but in the other one, they didn't actually officially form a separate party to do that. The American Independent Party is another small party that existed for a presidential election. I forget who the candidate was, but they didn't make it. The Conservative Party of New York State um, was a party active in New York that was reasonably successful in New York. The Libertarian Party, although they got one presidential elector once, I wouldn't consider that very successful because it was a faithless elector. So I would consider them to be a lower party, and perhaps even though it's currently, as far as I'm aware, the most popular third party, it is possibly one of the weaker third parties in American history. And then there's the Independence Party of Minnesota, a small party that got into the Senate.
Right, and yeah, Libertarian Party is the most popular third party currently, followed by the Green Party and then the Constitutional Party. At least with the last statistics I saw on that. But that's interesting what you had to say about the Libertarian Party at the end there, and of course all the others. That was a very fun history lesson. I guess we could bounce to the second graphic if you want to talk about that one. With the, oops, let me scroll back up with the green lines
Yep.
here.
The one with the years and percentages?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Yeah, so the Federalists were strongest in the 1790s. Um, they bounced back a little bit in the following decade because James Madison was unpopular for starting the War of 1812. But ultimately, they became completely subsumed by the Jeffersonian Republican Party during the presidentship of James Monroe. So a number of former Federalists joined that party, but they were actually still active um, in during those last years and formed part of a basis of the eventual National Republican Party, which wasn't strong enough on its own to beat the Democrats, even though the Democrats hadn't really reached their peak in power until the 1930s. Um, but the Anti-Mason Party actively competed against the National Republicans and the Democrats, but eventually merged with the National Republicans to form the Whig Party. The Whig Party wasn't the strongest party. It never reached full dominance. As we can see, their peak control of the Senate and the House was never really reaching 60%. So it was always a main party, but never the strongest party. And of course, in the 1850s, the issue of states' rights and North versus South and slavery caused the party to implode and to hemorrhage to other minor parties that emerged in that time period. Um, the the Know Nothings also became strong in the 1850s, but their policies didn't really stand up into the Civil War. And of course, it's the only third party to actually reach the top of the U.S. government in the case of um, the Speaker of the House, unless you count the nullifiers who had John C. Calhoun as the vice president in coalition with Andrew Jackson as the Democratic president. So those are the two third parties that made it to the top in that sense, because the vice president is the president of the Senate and therefore is one of the top offices in the country. Even though a lot of people consider it secondary to the president, it is a top office in its own right as president of the Senate. So then you have the emergence of a number of small parties. The Free Soil Party got 6.45% of Senate control, so it actually had a number of senators. But at that point, they weren't very strong. The Unionist Party, including unconditional unionists, those are two different parties. Sometimes they say it's the same party, but with a different name later on. But it's actually two different parties that were in competition with each other, but with similar positions. I counted them together here because a number of my sources did. So I decided to do that, even though I do acknowledge that they're separate, and the other chart does that. But together, they got 14.89% of the Senate and 17.03% of the House, showing that they were actually together, counting them together, a reasonably strong faction in Congress during the Civil War. Eventually, however, being absorbed by the Republicans largely, and also some of the Democrats. The Southern Rights Party, a very small party, got elected in 1852, but didn't really expand there because it was redundant to the Democratic Party. Republicans and National Union were the strongest in the 1860s in Congress. However, the most they ever got presidentially happened for Ronald Reagan in 1984 with 97.58, as opposed to the stronger FDR's 98.49% in 1936. And of course, the People's Party was another anti-slavery party that eventually merged with the Republicans relatively early on. The opposition party in the South, a pro-Southern party that became redundant to the Democrats in the South. The Constitutional Union Party, a presidential-only party. The Conservative Party got of Virginia 2.09%, and that's not surprising because it's a state-only party. The Liberal Republicans had actually a better amount of presidential votes than their achievements in Congress. Now, if they had actually received more presidential votes and the vote had not been split with the Democrats after Horace Greeley's death, they may have actually done better in Congress in following years, perhaps. Anti-Monopoly Party, relatively low percentage. The Greenback Labor Party actually had a decent number of representatives in the House in 1879. The Readjuster Party, a relatively small party that, however, managed to run both senators and representatives. A Union Labor Party, very small. People's Party, a reasonably small party. However, they did have a decent number of senators and some people in the House, and were big enough to influence the policies of the Democratic Party. They're also known as the Populist Party. The Silver Party and the Silver Republican Party existed at the same time, and although the Silver Party came first, the Silver Republican Party eventually was more powerful in Congress. The Socialists peaked in 1926 when they had, I believe, one candidate win for the House and another candidate share his candidacy with the 1924 Progressive Party. So he was a two-party candidate. So I split it halfway between them. So he was a sort of fusion ticket candidate in New York City, I believe. Then the Progressive Party, Theodore Roosevelt, had a decent showing in the presidential election, but ultimately remerged with the main parties. The Prohibition Party, small party that became redundant due to constitutional amendments, although I think they considered it a success in some way. The Farmer Labor Party, a local party, was reasonably successful in their state. eventually merged with the Democrats of that state, forming the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which still exists today. Um, the Progressive Party of 1924 had a mixed party candidate win in the House, uh, a few electors in the main election, but not much else in regards to achievement. The Wisconsin Progressive Party later on dominated Wisconsin politics for some time in the 1930s, but eventually fell away. The American Labor Party had some success, but nothing really long term. I think there was at least one member of the House that was a member long term, but other than a couple of candidates that they managed to get in, they didn't really expand from there. The States' Rights Democratic Party, presidential only party, American Independent Party, presidential only party, Conservative Party of New York State had one senator and a little bit of the House in 1980. The Libertarian Party had a faithless elector in 1972 and finally got somebody into the House in 2020, but I don't think they have that anymore.
Yeah, I believe Justin Amash
And
is who you're talking
yeah,
about, and he switched or decided not to become a libertarian anymore. If, anyway, but that doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah, yeah. By the way, now that I look at it, it's not that he got into office in 2020. 2020 was the year in which there were the most vacancies, and therefore, when his vote had the greatest relative power in Congress, uh, because he was elected, obviously, for the previous year. So the way these dates work is that they're a bit fiddly because of a question of vacancies in the House and whether you want to count uh, control of the House as including or excluding vacancies. So some of these numbers are change a bit based on that and based on whether you count from the election or when they're in office. So don't take these numbers on the years as 100% the way every scholar would put it. These are more ad hoc based on my studies. Uh, and the Independence Party of Minnesota had a senator in 2002 and not much since.
I just like how you put everything so concise with the graph. Like everything makes sense. As you said, the numbers are a little bit weird looking, but you kind of explained that part. So that makes a lot more sense to say when I first looked at it. But
Yeah, I decided to go, yeah, with percentage rather than the number because, of course, the Senate and the House have had different numbers over the years. So when people say things like Ronald Reagan got the most electoral votes ever, uh, since that may be true. However, we haven't always had the same number of electoral votes, uh, and if we count parties rather than candidates, the biggest win would be, um, I think it's the 1824 election where the Jeffersonian Republicans got 100%, even though none of them won in the actual election, and they had to go to have Congress decide. And then the party split because of how the decision went.
right, right.
Yeah. But I see that the greatest strengths here for these parties comes when a party is destabilized and therefore is hemorrhaging voters, or when there's serious issues that aren't being addressed and therefore there's corruption in a party. And we see that in the late 1800s. So we see the 1850s when the Whigs were destabilized, the 1820s when the original Republicans were destabilized, and we see the late 1800s when there was movements for civil service reform, and the parties were a bit corrupt. For example, frequently the Grant administration is accused of nepotism uh, and uh, and not being very thoughtful in how they pick people for various appointments. And so, in the civil service, there were a large number of people in both parties that were elected but weren't actually qualified for the job because they simply wanted to get their loyalists into office. And so that caused a number of problems.
Right, and I think that's why there's so much emphasis on kind of how we started the episode, where people were saying if you're unhappy with the party or the party's becoming unstabilized, people tend to look for other options. I think that's why there's a lot of attention paid towards, especially for third parties, to figure out how many people are upset or what strategies they could use to gain voters. Because even third parties, I think, are susceptible of adapting strategies that they think appeal to the masses, even if they, like the leaders of it, may not necessarily have that exact opinion. I think that even third parties do the same thing when it comes to that. They try to gain voters. And
Yeah.
yeah, I thought we could end with the last picture graph you showed, because I think that that would be a good way to kind of summarize data, and I don't want any of your work to go to waste, because it was all really good. Like, I'm very impressed and thankful that you made all these graphs. But this was the last one here. Oh, let me switch over so you can actually see it. There we go. And this was the one that had the president and from 0 to 10, and then had all of the parties below, and then what colored position what that they gained.
Yeah. So as we see, there's a clear difference here between parties that were established before 1860, which is the most powerful parties, then parties after that. You see the strong ones in the civil service reform era, sort of pre-Great Depression era. And then from the Great Depression on, you don't really see a lot of strong parties. And I would say that we can classify parties as, let's say, four types. So that a type 1 party is a main party. So these are first and second parties, parties that can gain the presidency or that can gain control of the Senate. Then you can have a type 2 party, which is a party that usually ranks 4 to 6 on here. These are parties that can gain dominance in a state. So these parties can gain governors and senators, but don't have the power to gain the president or vice president. And then there's and so these are the effective third parties. Now, the Libertarian Party is a 4 on here. However, I would give the caveat that um, their electoral vote that they received was a faithless elector vote. The governorship happened after the person was elected. It was Gary Johnson, and he later switched to the Libertarian Party. So, in theory, they should be lower if you're considering their actual success. However, if we're just looking absolutely as to what they achieved, they did achieve those things. However, they're not as powerful as they may seem because of that. So I would say that they are one of the weaker parties. And so that's the type 3 parties, the parties that don't really gain dominance of states. So these have 1, 2, 3 points where they may have gotten a senator, they may have gotten a governor, but they haven't gotten both. And so they're not too powerful. And then there's a Type 4 party, which is a party that runs but doesn't actually get into office or only is local on the state level. Uh, so those are the four types of parties that I would say. So to become a Type 1 party, that is a main party, what you essentially have to do is you have to replace another Type 1 party and siphon its voters away. And the Republicans did this successfully. Other than that, this hasn't really happened except for the case of the Jeffersonians gaining dominance and then splitting into two parties, which is how the Democrats and the National Republicans got made, and the Whigs being a merger of the National Republicans and the Anti-Masons. Uh, but other than that, those are the three ways in which these parties were established. So it's replacing a party, being a merger of a main party and a third party, or being a split of a one party dominant system, which means that small parties moving in and muscling in on the turf of these larger parties from an external perspective has only worked once, and that's in the case of the Republican Party. And it required the Whigs to be heavily divided, which the Republicans simply are not nowadays. So if the Libertarians want to win, it's going to be a very, very tough road ahead.
Right, for sure. And I've heard that several times about that the only way to really become a major party is to take over one of the parties, because America is very much a two party I would say state. I don't know if that necessarily works, but a two-party country when compared to, say, France or Britain or even Australia, where there's like usually 6 or 8 parties that are always within each other and could win the elections. That's not really what we have here in the United States. So, like my dad always says, it's like the only way any third party's ever gonna win is if they take over one of the parties, and he said that for like many, 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 many years now. So I think that that's a common
Yeah. Now that being
thought.
said,
No, sorry.
now that being said, I would say that viable strategies would include the idea of being a sub party within a party, uh, as there are different factions within parties, and there's also the idea of coalitioning with parties, as was done by the two unionist parties. They coalitioned with the Republicans and were dominant in that way. Or towards the end of a Whig party, there's the opposition coalition, which included the Whigs, but also the emerging Republicans and other parties.
Right, right. But the idea that history shows here in America through all these graphs and data that you collected, the idea of a third party trying to become huge within the nation, not maybe within their state, but basically become a president, become a vice president, become a senator, and in a large part even to become a senator. Let's just stop it there. Is a very uphill battle unless you decide to, like you just mentioned, coalesce or somehow take over the party. But if you simply have your own ideas, it's going to be a very uphill battle.
Yeah. I would say senator is actually one of the easier ones to gain here, uh, because there have been a number of independent senators like Bernie Sanders. So, it, so in that case, senator isn't actually the hardest one, because if I look at the percentage of parties that made senator out of the 39 parties, um, it's actually 58.97%. So more than half of these parties have actually had senators.
No, that's
Almost. almost 3/5.
That is actually a good point. I didn't necessarily think about that. We about Bernie Sanders and others, and that actually is a pretty high statistic to have for a lot of these third parties. So that's interesting to think about. You would think that maybe
Yeah.
if you do want to seek national attention, you could maybe spend more money on senator races. But then again, I think the main goal of all these parties, like I mentioned, is eventually to become president. Is it realistic? Well, you could argue about that. But I think the goal is to have a
Yeah.
president.
Now, that being said, this could be part of a bias of the data because I didn't include parties that actually never had a federal office. So in that case, if we're looking at smaller parties like I think the Green Party, um, if we include all those smaller parties like the Green Party, the Constitutional Party, the Reform Party, the percentage of all those parties together that have made senator is a lot lower. Now, in the case of the libertarians, they have had people that they've had at least one person in the House of Representatives. They've had Gary Johnson be a successful governor, even though he wasn't elected as a libertarian. So that actually is a difference there. But I would say if you made it onto the chart, you have a decent chance of being able to gain a senator if you have the money to do so, because a lot of it has to do with money. For example, one of the parties that I excluded because it was, in my view, um, a a candidate-only party, that is, a party that only existed for the purpose of getting a candidate rather than having any distinct position, and then the candidate went on to be an independent. It was a party that got a certain person elected as senator after he had lost in the primary. I think he was a Democrat, and then he went as an independent candidate who caucused with the Democrats. And I think independents are important to note because throughout American history, there have been a number of independents who have made it into Congress in both the Senate and the House as independent, plain independents, independent Republicans, independent Democrats. So that is independents that agree with the positions of a party, but that aren't part of the party structure. Those have existed. And even recently, there are a number of independents in the House, although they mostly align with the Democrats.
Right, right. Yeah, politics definitely comes down to money more than anything in a large part. You always kind of hear about it. There are examples, like I think it was in Florida with the was it senator race or governor race, where the Democrat candidate spent like 3 times as much and still lost to the Republican candidate in Florida. So it does happen, but usually the person that spends the most money wins the election in a large part.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at this chart just to see. So, I probably should have asked this question at the start, but just in case someone is curious, how did you go about collecting the data? Just so we can make sure everybody knows that.
What I did was okay, I went and I looked at most of this is Wikipedia. I'll be straightforward with this. Most of this is Wikipedia. I looked at it has a number of different pages relating to this. There's pages on each Congress. So page on first Congress, second Congress, third Congress, and every 2 years there's a new Congress. And those pages have that. And then there's also pages discussing the elections for the House or for the Senate in any given year. And if there was a discrepancy between the two pages, I would have to do further research in order to analyze that. And then there's also pages that discuss the party composition in various state governments. which I also used. And whenever there was a discrepancy, I had to look things up further. So there's also other external sources that I used as well, but I considered Wikipedia to be mostly reliable for this type of information. It doesn't seem like something where people would lie about it, especially considering that a lot of this information is also available from public records as well. Although, for example, in the case of South Carolina, I actually had a lot of trouble finding um, the information concerning house composition before the Civil War in South Carolina. Um, for some reason, that's some arcane knowledge that is a bit hard to find, but I did end up finding it. Finding a list of various individuals that had been in government in those years, and then I had to look them up individually to look at their party affiliation until I found the one for the party that I'm looking for. In that case, it was the nullifiers. I was wondering whether the nullifiers were only a national party or whether they also were active on a smaller state level. And I eventually found that they did have nullifiers on the state level.
Right, they're trying to make that a dark hidden secret of their past, it seems. uh, and yeah, I tend to find with any election stuff that Wikipedia generally is trustable, unless it's like a modern election, like the past couple elections. I don't know if I would necessarily trust Wikipedia for those, just because of how much media attention was around it. But like with history and what you're looking back on, I would think that they would be generally pretty accurate. No, but I don't think anyone's going to necessarily fiddle with that for who the constitutional candidate was in 18, whatever, or whatever the party was.
Yeah, the actual calculations, however, I did myself using a spreadsheet program.
That was for the graph that had the percentage numbers on there. Is that what the
Yeah,
calculations?
and also the total tallies and the percentage of achievement of political office by parties. Uh, that also is something I use the spreadsheet for, just to make it easier.
Right, right,
And the PDFs I gave you are derived from the spreadsheet that I made.
right. That makes sense. It's definitely in a spreadsheet platform, our spreadsheet look, if I can speak. But I don't necessarily know if you've
Yeah.
had any other questions or anything else you wanted to say about the data. I just wanted to let you give your theories and history behind that and uh, and all the data there. I don't know if you had any questions or anything.
No, I don't really have any questions about that. I think the data speaks for itself. Once again, I would point that there is a trend on achievements that shows that more recently it has become harder for parties to gain higher offices, third parties in particular, especially in the last 100 years, where if we were to look at the percentages, we see the Progressive Party in 1912 was really big. And then after that, you only have a few presidential candidates and a few local parties. And other than that, it's largely flat. So we see that there has been a sort of strength increase among the two main parties and an increasing political binary. Of course, that could change, but it really depends on whether the parties were destabilized. And in the case of Donald Trump, some people were thinking that Donald Trump's candidacy would destabilize the Republicans. Uh, both in the case of heavy Trump supporters on the one side and the sort of moderate centrist neocons on the other side, and then more hardcore Tea Party, libertarian leaning conservatives, paleocons on the third side. But that didn't end up happening, interestingly enough.
Right, and Right. We talked about that a little earlier. If you would have asked
Yeah,
me,
or the Democrats splitting. Yeah,
oh no, I was just gonna say
yeah,
if you
the,
would,
the Democrats splitting. Yeah,
right, right, yeah. If you would have asked me
okay.
these
Yeah,
questions
the,
a
the
year
Demo-
ago or 2 years ago, I think I would have had a different answer than I do now.
yeah,
But Democrat splitting, yeah.
yeah. The, and yeah, the Democrats splitting between the more left wing progressives, the party establishment that is towards the left, and then some blue dogs. Because interestingly enough, even though the party is moving more towards the left in its politicians, a lot of the supporters haven't moved as far. So there could be a reemergence of blue dogs, but it all depends on how the Biden presidency goes and whether there's a destabilizing factor at some point. Because what we see is the collapse of the Republicans during the Great Depression was partially because the Republicans were in power when those initial stages of a Great Depression hit. And so the Democrats were able to position themselves as the party to resolve the problem caused by the other party. Similarly, I would say the Republicans gaining a lot of power from the events of the Civil War, fighting against the Confederates, who in their own states had been largely supported by the Democrats. Now, of course, there were Northern Democrats too, and many of them were in favor of the Union, but there was a strong Republican dominance over the Democrats in the Reconstruction era. In that case, uh, so in that case, it all depends on whether there will emerge a crisis or serious issue that will destabilize the main parties.
Right, right. I think that's really the only way you seek a mass gain in percentages, gain in whatever field a third party needs. In other words, until that happens, you're only going to really be effective in a minimum of areas. Maybe a couple states for a major third party might be successful, but that's probably going to be your cap until you're able to really merge with somebody, which is in some ways some parties wouldn't want to do, some parties would, or take over the party. And I don't know if necessarily the parties that are the highest now, Libertarian, Green Party, and Constitutional Party, are big enough that a big major party would want to absorb them. Now, you could say for business sake
Yep.
and money's sake that any two party would want to absorb any third party that exists. But sometimes I think it's better for those parties to just ignore them and not give them any attention and just let them stay small, so to speak. And I think that that's kind of the approach that they're taking now.
Yeah, because that's another thing. Because from a perspective of, as I said before, the party establishment, the businesses supporting the parties, and politicians that want to remain in power, having third parties is a negative for all those three groups. And while for voters it would mean an increase in choice, the people that are actually in power have a net loss from such a situation. So, in that sense, there will always be a pressure to return to a two party system, no matter what happens. In at least in the way U.S. politics are.
Right, right. And we've talked about the electoral college before, but do you think the system that exists now, election wise, such as the winner take all approach, the electorals get to have a say, blah, 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 you know how the process works. Do you think that that's the biggest problem third parties face to have a major impact, or do you think third parties themselves are an issue? In other words, do you think the elections result in third parties staying small, or do you think that third parties are always going to stay small, even with the way elections work in the United States?
Well, I think partially It is because of elections. For example, if there were ranked choice voting, then third parties would have more of a chance. But I already explained why it would be against the interest of the people in power to let that happen. Um, and also, I do think there's also bad strategy in a lot of third parties, uh, that they don't really have a good plan to win, and a lot of them focus too much on the presidency rather than rather than replacing one of the parties on the national level. They should instead seek to replace it on a more local level.
Right, right. I definitely see two divides because I'm in a couple of libertarian Discord servers in Texas and national, right? And there's a big divide between people that are saying we need to focus as libertarians. We need to focus on individual elections, in some cases nonpartisan elections. Excuse me, where you don't have to run under a party or under identification, such as city councils, district boards, things like that. And then you can work your way up the ladder, so to speak. But we need to start on an extremely local basis. Then you have the other faction of that, where it's like, no, we need to make sure we have a super strong general election. And we need to put a ton of money into it because that's the only chance that anybody's going to know that we exist. And we need to, do these things and this thing, and we need to just make sure we throw everything at one election. And that's the kind of the strategy that they have. So I can see that there's these two divides even within a third party that exists and what their strategy should be.
Yeah. But ultimately, if you're not going to be winning in other areas, does it really matter if those people know that your party exists?
Right, which is a good point. Which is a good point.
Yeah. Because let's say you're running, you have a viable chance of winning an office in Oklahoma, uh, but you're also publicizing to everywhere else. If you're publicizing to everywhere else, but you're not going to win everywhere else, then the name recognition for your party doesn't really matter because the people that can actually vote in the election that you have a chance of winning are in Oklahoma.
Right, right.
Just hypothetically speaking.
No, no, I definitely understand what you're
Now,
saying
of
for sure.
course, yeah, yeah, because what that will then create is a lot of social media hype that leads you into a false sense of confidence because you think that you have more supporters than are actually relevant to your position. Because if I'm running for office in Florida, for example, and I receive a lot of social media support from people in Oregon, Texas, and West Virginia, that's very good and it's confidence boosting, but it doesn't actually help me win in Florida.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Like, you could even be popular in a couple of states, but you still need a majority of states to win an election. That's one point to that. And another thing that is kind of common with it is a lot of people, even if you have a successful general election campaign, and for third parties, that's usually 3 to 5%, because that gives them a chance to be on the debate stage and get money for the next election cycle. So that's usually considered a success for the general election, right? But even if you do, let's just say hypothetically, get 5%, which would be extremely successful, the majority of the general public is still going to think that that's fell. Because 5%, like if you score on your test 5%, then you're that's terrible. Like you have to take the test again. Like there's no way around that. So I still think even if you do have a very successful campaign and get that percentage, uh, the people you're trying to oppress doing that are still going to see it as a failure.
That's true. They're going to see it as your candidacy not being viable to win, and also for people that might like your policies but are interested in winning, it'll feel like a negative spoiler effect especially if it leads to their candidate having a lesser share than they postulate they would have had if the third party didn't run.
Right. Yep. Which is also a kind of a interesting concept. That's why I'm much more in support of local elections and trying to change politics through as locally as you can get, even if
Yeah.
that means just being on the school board.
Also, running multi-party endorsements or fusion tickets. As well, a fusion ticket would be if you have two different parties actually on the ticket, but endorsing a candidate of a different party that is more favorable to your party than a further different candidate that is unfavorable might be a good strategy because it also makes that party friendlier to your position because you're less threatening. You're not directly competing. You're in coalition with that party on at least one candidate. And in parliamentary politics, that's very effective. Uh, and even though the U.S. is not parliamentary, having coalitions still would be something that is useful. And it also means that the party won't try to make your party redundant by trying to copy your positions because they're going to get the votes anyway, because you're supporting that party. Of course, getting the main party to copy your positions as a small party can be a success in itself, depending on what type of party it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I never really have thought about that strategy before, and in a large part, it does make some sense. I'm just thinking of the parties that exist now, and I don't necessarily see the Libertarian Party doing that. I don't. I could maybe the Green Party with a progressive candidate because a lot of their policies align the Green New Deal with the Green Party and other aspects of it. And the Constitutional Party, I don't really know enough about to know what they necessarily would do. But that does seem like a potential winning strategy a lot more than just trying to win by yourself.
Yeah, but I think we've said everything that can be said about the issue based on just basic information anyway.
Yes, yes. I think we have said everything as well. I ran out of questions. um, the next week's show is going to be on Anavultus' channel, and you can find him on YouTube. And we'll let me restart. Next week is going to be on Anavultus' channel. If you do have any potential questions for us or maybe topic ideas or anything like that, you can definitely let us know in the comment section of this video or on Anavultus' channel, wherever you choose to do so. You could also do so on Discord, and I will check it there, and we'll be more than willing to potentially do your topic. We have done one before. And I'll let you introduce if you have any other any other videos out on your schedule or guest shows or anything like that, and then we'll get out of here.
No, I don't really have anything on my schedule right now. So, however, I do have my book, Actionable Justice. People can look that up. So, thank you all for watching.
Yes, thank you, and we'll catch you on the next one.